Even the neighborhood kids would call out her name when we trotted by. The smell of burning leaves drifted through the limbs of the trees. I was happier than I had ever been, and sadder at the same time. One day at lunch, I burst into tears. No one tried to console me because they all felt the same way. This had been such a glorious summer. I am going to miss Penny so much, I finally choked out. She'll miss you too, Sugar, Mrs. Mack said as she took my hand. I don't want her to be lonely. Who will brush her every day? Who will hug her and tell her how much they love her? I cried. I will, Sugar, Mrs. Mack said quietly. Nancy pointed to a worn photo tacked to the wall. It was of a meadow. She'll go up north to Ashley to stay on Mrs. Mack's farm with the other horses, Nancy told me. Farm? I questioned. I didn't know you had a farm, I said to Mrs. Mack. Prettiest place you'll ever see, Donnie said. So the tiny trailer she lived in here wasn't Mrs. Mack's only home. It was at that moment that I realized that Mrs. Mack chose to be in Dogpatch with her horses and these kids. Maybe because of the kids. I looked at her and Donnie and Nancy, and without another word, we stood there and hugged each other for the longest moment. Some mornings later, it was overcast and dark when I arrived at the stables. I saw Donnie and Nancy standing waiting for me and Doc Beck's truck parked in front. Something was wrong. My heart stopped in my chest. I knew it was Penny. I ran to the back of the lot where her stall was. I found her down. Doc Beck was leaning over her, holding a mirror next to her nostrils. A trickle of blood was running from her nose. Oh, Doc, I managed to squeeze out. He stroked her neck. A viral infection of some kind, Pat. If we can't get her to her feet, it will most certainly go to pneumonia. Oh, God, please, please, were the only words that came to me. My heart was pounding. This isn't good, Pat. When an animal this size lies down with an ailment like this, the lungs will fill with body fluid. She'll drown in her own blood if we can't get her to her feet. I sank to my knees and pulled her head into my lap. Her only hope is for us to somehow suspend her so that she can stand. Right now, she can't support her own weight. Then let's try to get her up. We have to, I screamed. She needs a Springer sling, Doc Beck said thoughtfully. We don't have one at the college. Doc Beck taught there. We could send to Ann Arbor, but that would take hours. We don't have that kind of time. We have to try, I sobbed. I am sorry, Doc Beck said. Pat, Sugar, Mrs. Mack pleaded. Penny rattled when she struggled to breathe. Her lungs were already filling. Her eyes looked dim and full of pain. I watched Doc Beck fill a huge syringe. She'll suffer otherwise, Pat, Donnie was saying through his own tears. Nancy rocked to her knees. I'm so sorry, Pat. I started sobbing so hard that drool fell in ribbons from my mouth. Mrs. Mack, I said between sobs, after, will you take her to the farm? Bury her there? Promise me. She squeezed my hand. I knew that she would. Doc Beck took the needle and held it up to the light to look at the fluid in it, then moved toward Penny. I closed my eyes and held her head next to my heart. Then the stable door swung open. We looked up. It was Hap. Donnie told me, he said gruffly. Well, you ain't tried everything yet. Hap, there's nothing to be done, Doc Beck cautioned him. That sling Donnie said you needed? I think we could make it out of this. He pulled a huge canvas bag through the stable door. It's my riggin', Bernice, he said to Mrs. Mack. My riggin' from the circus. Got more in the shed if you need it. Doc Beck smiled and pulled open the bag. There certainly is apparatus here that we might use, all right. Everyone sank to their knees and pulled Hap's rigging out onto the floor. I had never seen so many ropes, pulleys, brass fittings, and wide pieces of leather in my life. Mrs. Mack was looking up at a crossbeam above the stall. This beam will hold her weight, she said. Mrs. Mack, Doc, and Hap, with us helping, worked as fast as they could to make the sling. A perfect Springer sling, Doc Beck finally said. Then we managed to ease the rigging around Penny's withers and hindquarters, and we all pulled. But it was no use. We didn't have the strength to get her to her feet. Get up, girl. Get up, my beautiful copper Penny, I pleaded, but Penny didn't move. I stopped begging out loud. Instead, I thought as hard as I could. Please, baby, please, I said in my heart. Penny's eyes found mine. Her ears stood up. She waffled. "There's my Penny girl, baby," I kept saying in my head. She raised her head. She struggled and rolled, and with each roll, everyone pulled on the ropes. Finally, she rolled up onto her front legs, and then, within a hearty groan, gave one last push that brought her to both legs. She was weak, but she was up. We all stayed with her through the night, loosening the ropes bit by bit as she supported more and more of her own weight. Doc Beck stayed by her side all night. Her breathing became clearer and clearer. He gave her more shots to help. He kept listening to her chest with a stethoscope. We kept searching his face. Near morning, he listened again. He snorted and puffed his unlit cigar for a moment. Then he beamed into a broad smile. "She passed this here crisis," he announced. "This mare is going to be fine, just fine." Donnie and Nancy cried. Mrs. Mack kept patting their shoulders, saying, "We did it, we did it." I noticed old Hap sneaking away like his quiet self. I ran over to him and tugged his hand. "Thank you, Hap. Thank you," I cried. He hugged me. Tears ran down his rough old face. Mrs. Mack hugged both of us. The three of us seemed almost like we were one. As Hap turned to leave, he simply put up one of his hands. He pushed it toward me, and with the other hand pointed to the horseshoe nail ring and smiled. When that summer ended, I wept the bitterest tears of my life, only to shed tears of pure joy as I went back to the little stable every summer for the next 7 years. Dogpatch and the folks who were at the stable on the night of crisis were changed after that summer. Old Hap was a new man. In time, he took a wife, the widow who lived across the street. He became known as a helpful, almost jolly neighbor there in Dogpatch. Donnie had his dream too, to be a veterinarian like Doc Beck. He went to veterinary school right there in Lansing. No one really knows who helped him, but we have a good idea. Donnie returned to Dogpatch long enough to marry Nancy. Then they moved down to Shelbyville, Tennessee. Mrs. Mack gave Penny to me to have for my very own that next summer, and I kept Penny at my dad's until I was 18 and went away to college. Then Dad returned Penny to Mrs. Mack and her farm in Ashley, Michigan. In the summer of my 26th year, I visited Mrs. Mack on that little farm with my 2 small children. She led us to the meadow where Penny stood. Penny turned and looked at me and waffled. She walked slowly toward me. Her muzzle was flecked with gray, but her eyes were still full of grace and intelligence, her neck still arched, and her tail held high. My eyes followed her contours once again. She was still perfect. She stood there while the sun danced through the leaves of the overhanging trees, her coat gleaming like a bright copper penny. In the winter of my 30th year, my father called to tell me that my sweet copper penny had died. Patricia, she was almost 28 years old. "What a horse, what a horse," he had said over and over. Mrs. Mack told me to tell you that she kept her promise. I knew that she would.